Welcome back to the Wall Street Shuffle. I'm your host today, Dan Stewart. Thank you for joining us. And if you've got any questions or comments, you can call us at 877-326-3255. Again, that's 877-326-3255. Alternatively, you can go to the Wall Street Shuffle and go to comments at the Wall Street Shuffle and send in a question. I'll get it pretty quickly. You can also download our podcast. And for instance, if you missed the second half of Frank's interview and you really liked what he said, but you had to go inside or go shopping, well, it'll be archived within 24 hours, and you can check him out. Frank, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you.
All right. Well, let's get right into it. I know that a lot of our listeners will be interested in this. We've got a lot of defense companies, here in Dallas, but especially in Fort Worth. And so I think they'll really be interested in what you have to say. And folks, if you've actually got a question, regarding the budget cuts, you can certainly call in. But how is the 2013 defense budget cuts? How is that going to affect? Well, first of all, how big are they? What's going to be the size, overall size, and then let's narrow it down to Texas. How's that going to affect Texas?
Let me start, if I can, by making sort of an initial observation, because
sure.
I think we've got to be clear about the scope of this problem before we can start talking about the specific impacts. The scope of this problem is that in the first 3 years of the Obama administration, it took approximately $330 billion out of the investment in our defense capabilities. In the first phase of a two-phase process known as the Budget Control Act, which is supposed to extend out over the next 10 years, they propose to take another $487 billion out of these defense capabilities.
Right.
Another piece of legislation, that is to say the second part of that Budget Control Act that was adopted last late summer, envisions taking another $500 billion out of our defense capabilities, again, over 10 years' time. You put all that together, you're talking about something on the order of $1.2 trillion. And
so
not
essentially,
surprisingly,
they're gutting the defense, our defense budget.
I personally would characterize it as the evisceration of our national security capabilities, because what it means is these sequential cuts have a cumulative impact. And, when people say, oh, well, it's just $487 billion in the first year, it's only going to be about $5 billion, and you start seeing lots of different budget games and smoke and mirrors, the reality is these are real impacts, not just on what kinds of capabilities our military has, its ability to project power, to have presence in various parts of the world, to train its troops, to ensure that they've got the appropriate health care coverage and pay and other benefits to ensure that we can continue to have an effective all-volunteer force. It also has impacts on the economy as well, on jobs, high-paid, high-skilled jobs, many of them, and the industrial core, the manufacturing base of this country, which is what's left of it, still largely in the aerospace and in the shipbuilding trades. You take all this together, and it is, I believe, a disaster. And that's true nationwide, and I think it's going to be true especially for a state like Texas. Let me give you some estimates of what we think, when you put all of these impacts together, it will mean for Texas. Approximately 91,000 jobs will be lost. Approximately $5.5 billion worth of earnings lost, and an impact on the gross state product of almost $8 billion. Now that's real money.
And that's also probably, I'll round off and keep it simple, probably around $1 billion plus of tax revenue to the state of Texas that Texas won't get.
Well, we haven't done that calculation. But
sure, that's okay.
Whatever it is,
yeah.
I'm just saying the quantifiable perceptible, demonstrable impacts are
Sure.
on the order that I've just talked about.
Are huge,
and
yeah.
anything else which you can impute to it is just additive and further damage.
That's absolutely true. And you know, getting back to it, you've always got to net all the pros and cons. Like you were saying, the high-paying jobs. I've got a few clients in the aerospace industry, and for the most part, you know, 3 out of 4, 4 out of 5 of them, whatever, you know, they make six-figure salaries. So let's assume they're at the 30% bracket. So the federal government's also going to lose revenue. But really the main thing is you hit the nail on the head. It's one of our last bastions of manufacturing that we need to, you know, keep. Number one. Number two, it's our defense. And that's really, in my opinion, the Constitution calls for the federal government to have 3 or 4 really main objectives. And defense is right up there, number one. Without defense, we have no country.
That's exactly right.
And you can't buy defense. You can't build your planes and your ships overseas, because then you're beholden to the countries overseas.
Well, you know, it's interesting you say that, because there was a hearing in the Senate Armed Services Committee back, I think, in October of last year, in which they had done a study of the defense industry, and they discovered, to their horror, that there were counterfeit and fraudulent Chinese parts that were being used in some of our weapon systems. And the committee was up in high dudgeon, and I had a chance to see an old friend of mine by the name of Senator John McCain, who's the ranking member of that committee. That I think it was the night before the hearing, and I said, John, I get that this is a problem, but isn't there kind of a more serious problem, namely that we have any Chinese parts in our weapon systems, even if they work, at least in peacetime? Isn't that a problem?
And isn't it a big problem that we didn't know about it? We kind of found out after the fact.
Right.
I mean, they're sliding.
The truth of the matter is, it's catastrophe if, in fact, as we must expect, those Chinese parts won't work in time of need. And here's the kicker: if we do indeed get rid of what's left of our defense industries, or not get rid of them entirely, probably, but greatly weaken them, there will be some subcontractors, for example, some second and third tier vendors who will go out of business. Well, that means we're going to have to be buying our stuff from the Chinese, or perhaps from others who may be slightly less unreliable, but it's not a sound national security policy. And I just have to ask the question. I know your show, your audience is probably principally focusing on, you know, financial and fiscal matters rather than defense.
Oh no, we're actually a kind of, not so much libertarian, but we're constitutionalist.
Well,
we're conservative constitutionalists who happen to also like to make money.
Right, and God bless you. I think that's the American way. But I just wanted to say, even if you're approaching this first and foremost from the point of view of what's good for our economy, what's going to enable us to get this cart out of the ditch and get people jobs and have, you know, a vibrant, prosperous America again. Well, I think a program that has at its core something that actually eliminates jobs by the tens of thousands. You know, by some estimates countrywide, it'll be over 1 million high-paying jobs.
Oh, you don't even get me started.
This is the kind of thing that is actually going to only exacerbate the problems we've got, not remedy them. And then on top of it, it's going to be really bad for the national security. And as you say, if we're not providing for the common defense, you can pretty much forget about everything else.
Well, right. And I mean, just think about it on the surface. It's as simple as this. If counterfeit Chinese parts are going in our planes or our weapon systems, that means that the Chinese already have enough knowledge to know the parameters and the size of that part. They know enough about the defense system or the plane itself that they can actually build a part. I mean, that's scary right there. I mean, that's a breach of national security, is it not?
Well, I don't even know where to begin with that particular question because, you know, they're into our computer systems. Did you cover the story about the Nortel networks?
Yeah, the hacking. Yeah.
Well, for 10 years. Into one of our major telecommunications companies, long before they were able to figure out that they were even there, let alone what they got out of it. And by the way, that story was particularly interesting to me because I think probably in part because the Chinese have been in their knickers, you had this company coming undone. And what did it do? It sold off bits and pieces of it. And apparently, or at least there's no evidence to believe contrary, apparently what they sold with those parts were compromised IT systems.
Sure,
so
sure.
those have now migrated elsewhere.
Sure.
Into our telecommunications and God only knows what other parts of our economy. So this is the kind of thing the Chinese are doing all the time. And when you add on top of it, as you say, getting insights through, vendor relationships, among other things, into our weapons designs and perhaps the ability to compromise them, it's a tragedy. It's an absolute disaster, and we're not paying attention to it, let alone remedying it, as I think we must.
All right, Frank, real quick, can we take a listener question? We got a caller that has a question. Do you mind fielding that?
No,
all right.
No, go ahead.
And by the way, folks, the story that he's talking about is that the Chinese were actually infiltrating not only our government for 10 years, they were also hacking into private corporations in search of technology secrets and software secrets, basically pirating our software and our technology. So that's a serious crime. But they were hacking into our government, our military, which is
specifically in this case the Nortel networks. I think they've been attacking the others
for
all along.
Even longer.
But this was one that we now know actually succeeded for 10 years, almost entirely
without us knowing it. Yeah.
Right.
All right. Well, folks, we've got Jason on the line. Jason, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. You have a question for Frank?
I do. I just think things get lost when we talk about budget cuts, because I think we all agree we need to cut the budget. And my question really is for defense spending. I mean, is it in 2008, say, did we spend $1 billion? And then in 2009 or going forward, we say, well, we're cutting the budget, but I think we're still spending as much or more money. Is that true or not?
No, I think what you're sort of alluding to is a study that has been cited by, Ron Paul, among others, that actually all this is really going to do is slow the rate of growth. It turns out the analysis that underpinned that, I think was produced by the Mercator Institute, was simply wrong. It was improperly done. It failed to take into account the cuts that took place in the first few years. It looks as though if everything goes according to plan, there will be some slight increase in the rate of growth from a much lower starting point, but in fact, it's real cuts. And especially if this second round of them, the so-called sequestration cuts, take effect, there's no question this is a very serious reduction in, as I say, not just the defense budget, but in defense capabilities. This is going to be across the board in terms of the modernization of our forces, in terms of the maintenance of the ones we've got, the weapon systems and so on we've got in place right now, the training of our forces, the pay and benefits of our personnel, and on and on. It really is a wrecking operation, I believe.
Okay.
Jason, do you have any other question?
Well, yeah, kind of, because I listened to, I forget his name, the Major General that you guys have on sometime.
Valerie?
He talks about kind of shifting our military, that we don't need a big military anymore. We need a small, agile military with the technology.
Well,
do these budget cuts come from personnel, or is it really going to affect the defense contractor? I mean, other than maybe, some helicopters they decide not to make, but...
Well, let me clarify that. What General Vallely said was when you go fight these wars, especially in Afghanistan, where it's real, mountainous and it's very tough, rather than sending in 30 or 50,000 troops, you need to fight a smarter war, and you have to have the lily pad approach with 200 or 300 special forces going in and out and making quick strikes. Don't try to sit there and be a squatter for years. That's very costly, very expensive. So he's not talking, but he will agree that you need some cuts in some of the defense systems, but you got to pick and choose, and you got to let the military decide what's important rather than Congress. And Ed, Frank, I just wanted to clarify what he said. It was more about the fighting the wars than the military systems himself. But where do you think we can cut?
Let me say at the outset, Paul Vallely is an old friend of mine, a man I admire greatly. He was the chairman of our military committee at the Center for Security Policy for a number of years. I'm familiar with sort of his thinking on the sort of lily pad approach. I think going forward, if you can make it work, great. But I don't think Paul would say, and I certainly don't believe, that you want to dispense with your capability to have the kinds of large and conventional forces that you may need in the future to deal with large and conventional threats in different spaces,
in different theaters,
not this counterinsurgency strategy business. Look, we're going to make cuts. I mentioned at the outset, we're making $330 billion worth of cuts already. That's done. We got another $487 billion that are going to be made no matter what over the next 10 years. So I would simply answer, defense is given at the office. There's no comparable cuts that have been made in even discretionary domestic spending, let alone in entitlements. There's been essentially no reductions in entitlement spending at all. So I think before we start talking about how much more we can cut out of defense, we ought to be thinking about, are we doing this in a way that represents in any way, shape, or form the balance that should be used in these sort of circumstances, and most especially because, as you said yourself, what we're looking at here is not just another question of our social safety net or one of the things that we now take for granted in terms of entitlement spending or another. It's the actual ability to ensure the future survival of the United States. And for those who think that that can't possibly be at risk, all I would say is stay tuned.
Yeah, read history.
Watch what's coming.
Jason, thanks so much for calling. We appreciate it. And said another way, I just want to reemphasize what you just said. Until you start hitting Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare and some of these huge entitlement programs, the cutting defense even by $1 trillion doesn't solve the problem. You don't solve the problem unless you have an encompassing across the board. I mean, you need to cut education, but again, it's in the Department of Energy. I mean, you can find cuts everywhere. Sure. But until you hit the entitlements, it doesn't matter. You could cut every other part of our budget, but if you leave Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare alone, we still go bankrupt. So that's my bully pulpit. All right, well, let's move on to a different topic because I do want to talk about this. I do want to, before we get off, what about the Sharia threat to U.S. citizen civil rights?
Well, I'm really glad you asked about that because it's one that I'm really very concerned about. We wrote a book in the fall of 2010 called Sharia, The Threat to America, which I really would commend to people. In fact, so much so that you can get it for free at shariathethreat.com if you want to download it. It's a really, I think, required reading product of the Center for Security Policy, a wonderful group we call Team B2 of world-class experts on this threat doctrine and intelligence experts and other serious national security professionals. And what we found out in doing this study, looking at the institutions and traditions and texts of mainstream Islam, I use that word advisedly, mainstream Islam,
right.
is that there is, in addition to the practice of the faith, this political, military, legal doctrine, an ideology, if you wish, called Sharia, that is absolutely antithetical to our Constitution and designed to destroy this country and, for that matter, any other that stand in the way of the triumph of Sharia worldwide and its practice worldwide under a ruler known as a caliph. And whether it's Al-Qaeda, who's trying to impose that doctrine through violent means, or whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood, who's trying to impose it through more stealthy techniques, at least initially, it represents a mortal peril to our country and, I think, to freedom-loving people everywhere else. It is in our nation, tragically. You saw it down in Dallas not so long ago with the Holy Land Foundation trial.
Right.
A lot of the documentation that we built our report about was introduced into evidence in the Holy Land Foundation trial, including, interestingly enough, a document which was the strategic plan of the Muslim Brotherhood in America. It's contained as the second appendix of our book, and I would just say to people, if you don't want to fool with the entire book, if you don't want to download the whole thing, if you don't want to go out and buy Sharia, The Threat to America, just go grab the, whatever it is, 19 pages, I think, that are the second appendix at that website, shariathethreat.com, and read it because it tells you everything you need to know about the enemy we're up against right now and the Sharia doctrine that animates it. Okay,
and so with Sharia law, what you're saying is, according to them, it's my way or the highway, and there's no such thing as freedom of religion. In other words, in America, our Constitution dictates that we can have you can be a Catholic, you can be a Protestant, you can be a Muslim, you can be whatever, Jewish, you can be whatever you want. You're saying over time they're going to want, you've got to convert to Sharia Islam?
Well, if you're a person of the book, as the Quran says, which is to say either the Old Testament or the New Testament, you actually get three choices. You can convert to Islam.
Right.
You can live as what they call a dhimmi, an enslaved people, or you can die. If you don't happen to be a person of the book, a Christian or Jew, then you basically just have the first and third choices, namely you convert or die. But either way, it's pretty unappealing, I think, to most of us. And for most of us, we, I think, are so incredulous that this could really happen here. In a Judeo-Christian nation, after all, a nation that has a constitution that enshrines, our freedom of religion and all the rest. But I will tell you, and this is one of the important insights that we took in our book, I think, is look at what is happening to Europe right now, and you will see the trajectory these guys have in mind taking us on as well. We're not as far along, to be sure, but in Europe today you can be prosecuted for speaking in ways that give offense to Muslims. You can be actually, put in mortal peril of your life if they decide that you're an enemy. There are no-go zones, 750 of them, by the way, in France today, where the authorities can't go.
Yeah, which means they won't go because it's Muslim territory.
Too dangerous.
They're afraid. They're afraid to go, right?
Yep, they're terrified to go, and Sharia is practiced in those areas inside, a country that has its own system of laws and so on. But here's a data point that's very striking, very, very real time. Just last week, a judge in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, ruled that a Muslim who had assaulted a man wearing a Halloween costume called Zombie Muhammad was not culpable of doing, assault and battery, a violent act, on the grounds that he was legitimately offended by what had been done by the man wearing that costume, expressing his, constitutional right to speech and dress and so on. And here's the thing. That's not an isolated incident. It's just one example. We did a study at the Center for Security Policy last year. You can find it at Sharia in AmericanCourts.com. It looked at 50 cases, found 27 instances in 23 different states where the court upheld the use of Sharia in our court system. So it's not as far along as Europe, to be sure, but it's coming. Unless we are awakened to the danger, and that's what Sharia, the threat to America, is all about, and start taking steps to counter it.
All right. Well, I'm definitely going to go download that book just so I can enlighten myself and at least read about. I mean, I'm a history buff anyway. I like to always learn and do my due diligence. Frank, it's been wonderful having you on. We'd like to have you back.
Mine. Anytime.
Well, take care, folks. That was Frank Gaffney. He's the founder and president at the Center for Security Policy, and he just spoke about the defense budgets and how that's going to affect Texas and Sharia law, how it conflicts with our rights. You can go to securefreedomradio.org or centerforsecuritypolicy.org to find out more. And if you want to go to find that book he was talking about, you can go to shariathethreat.com and check it out. Folks, we'll be right back with the final segment on the Wall Street Shuffle, and call in with any questions or comments. We'll be right back.